When I was at Wat Pah Nanachat, there were a number of signs with quotations and Dhamma sayings that were stuck up around the property. There was, for example, there was one that just said, made like a palm tree stump, not to arise again in future times, and it was nailed to a palm tree stump. There's another one in the central area that said, suffering is not a personal problem, Ajahn Sumedho. Now that seems like one of those paradoxical statements because, of course, you feel like your suffering is a personal problem. This points to, I think, one of the real issues in practice. People start on the path usually goaded by suffering, some kind of suffering in their life, and they become spiritual seekers. And very often, if people haven't faced real suffering in their life, then they have difficulty getting serious about the practice. And something I remember Kama said a number of times when someone, someone who came for teachings here in those days and didn't last or went away quickly or didn't fooled around, he would say he'll be back after he has had some more suffering. So you start with that kind of initial bias or way of looking at things through a very self-oriented lens, and this can become a major stumbling block later on in the practice if you don't take it past that point. I've quoted before in these talks something that I read that really struck me as being very apt. It was an article in a book about Buddhism and psychology, and it was one of the Western Vipassana teachers asked a Burmese master who was visiting IMS, one of the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition Burmese teachers. He asked him, why is it that Burmese people seem to make such rapid progress in insight meditation, and Westerners often struggle for years without really getting anywhere? And the Burmese teacher said that from what he's observed, he says most of the Westerners aren't doing Vipassana at all. They're doing self-psychoanalysis. And I think that's a very apt description of how many people get caught up in their own stuff, their own particular issues, trying to resolve your own neuroses, your own fears and anxieties. If it doesn't get beyond that level, you'll never take it to a real in-depth penetration of the Dhamma. The teaching is not about, the Third Noble Truth is not about making an end of this particular suffering. It's making an end of all suffering. And if you allow yourself to become caught up in your own formations, which ultimately is what we're talking about, if you're caught up in your own mental formations and see them as significant, important, unique, then you're not penetrating into the depth. One of the ways the Buddha approached this issue was talking about samsara in a general sense. Samsara is the round of becoming. It's this conditioned world. It means like most Pali abstract nouns is derived from a verb, the verb samsarati, which means to wander around in circles, basically. And this is the idea of samsara. The Buddha said that, for example, there's a whole series of these metaphors in the Samyutta Nikaya. He said, for example, that if you were to gather together all the sticks and branches and twigs and grass in the whole of Jambudipa, the whole of this earthly continent. If you were to gather them all together and chop them into 4-inch pieces and make a pile, and then you were to go through the pile saying, this one represents my mother, this one represents my mother's mother, this one represents my mother's mother's mother, this represents her mother, this represents her mother, you would exhaust the pile of sticks before you came to the beginning of the sequence of mothers. He said that in another metaphor, he said that if you were able to gather together all the blood you have shed from having your head chopped off, from times you were born as a cow or a goat or a pig or a chicken, or the times you were born as a human and fell into robbery or burglary, and the king's men cut your head off. If you were to gather together all this blood, it would be greater than the 4 great oceans. Likewise, all the tears you have shed from the loss of loved ones in the great samsara is greater than the 4 great oceans. All the mother's milk you have drunk is of greater volume than the 4 oceans. All the bones you've left behind, if they had not been rotted away and piled up, they would be higher than the Himalaya mountains. There's a whole series of these to express the great extent of time and the great number of lives that we all have lived. In the same sequence of suttas, he said that rebirth in the samsara is like throwing a stick into the air. Sometimes the stick falls with the top end down, sometimes it falls with the bottom end down, sometimes it lands flat in the middle. So you can be reborn into any kind of state. And he also said that if you see any living being enjoying happiness and felicity of any kind, you can be sure that at some time in the past you too have enjoyed this kind of happiness. And if you see any being of any kind suffering in misery and pain, you can know that at some time in the past I too have suffered this particular misery and pain. When the Buddha himself attained his full awakening, it's described in terms of the arising of 3 knowledges in the three watches of the night. In the first watch of the night, he attained to the knowledge of his past lives, going back thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of kappas, of ages of the world. At this time I had such and such a name, I belonged to such and such a clan, such was my pleasure, such was my pain. I passed away from that existence and I arose there where I had such and such a name, such and such a clan, such was my pleasure, such was my pain. In the second watch of the night, he attained to the knowledge of the workings of Kama, and he understood and saw with his Buddha eye the rising and falling of beings. And in the third watch of the night, he attained to the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas, the root defilements. So his being was perfectly purified. And this occurred just as Venus was breaking the horizon in the pre-dawn. So these 3 knowledges, the Te Vidya, they represent first an understanding of the personal. So the first knowledge is at a personal level, but it's an entire exhausting of self-knowledge, understanding his entire history, going back an indefinite number of hundreds of thousands of world ages. This alone is not full awakening. In the second watch of the night, it was taken from the personal to the general, and he understood the general principles of how this works, the universal laws that apply to all beings. So that now samsara, it was fully understood, and this allowed the third knowledge of full awakening, the purification of the being. So this, at this very sublime level of the Buddha, this applies at a more limited level to our own practice, that we have to get beyond a narrow obsession with our own stuff. That same article that talked about Westerners doing psychoanalysis on themselves then went on to make the point that the meditation should be about process, not about content. This is very important, that our own experiences and our own karmic knots, our own situation, is only important in that it's the only case study, the only example of the universal that we can really examine in depth. This is what we've got to work with. But we should be trying to get behind that and seeing the universal laws underneath it. So it's not important what you're thinking about, what you're worrying about, what you're fearing, what you're hoping, what you're imagining. What's important is understanding, seeing the process of fear, of anxiety, of hoping, of imagining, seeing how that works, getting underneath that at that kind of nuts and bolts level. It helps to get out of that obsession with the personal, to cultivate what the Tibetan teachings they call the big view, which is seeing the samsara rather than seeing, my stuff, seeing the universality of things. A few years ago, when I started researching that cosmology business, and I wrote an article for Punnadhammo magazine on the topic, and I mentioned in that article the Tibetan mudra of the they call the mandala offering, where you hold your hands in a way to indicate Mount Meru and the four continents, and offer it for the liberation of all sentient beings. And I interpreted that in a very Theravadan way as being, and I still think it's a valid interpretation, this is the total abandonment, total relinquishment, giving up the whole of existence in all forms. But editor at Punnadhammo magazine, who was versed in the Tibetan teachings, came back with a criticism that that's not how the Tibetans interpret it. They interpret it as cultivating the big view, getting beyond oneself. So an offering of the self is only a little offering, but an offering of the whole of the world system is a big offering, it's a big view. And the Buddha taught a lot about samsara in terms of endless sequence of rebirths, and how people think about birth and death and rebirth. This is also bears on the same point. There are, of course, many people nowadays who don't take those teachings seriously, don't believe in rebirth, and then they're limited by that view to this life and Be hard to imagine how you could break out of the narrow self-view. But then people who do take on the idea of rebirth often hold it in a wrong way. People are very, and this is something actually the Buddha specifically cautioned against, being overly curious and obsessed with, oh, what was I in the past, you know, and want to find out, who was I in my past life. And this is still a kind of a narrow view. The Buddha is saying, you were everything in your past life. You've been up and down, round and round, and tried out this and that and the other thing. And it doesn't really matter any one particular existence. And the idea of understanding rebirth in this very large way, that in the wheel of samsara, is to become wearied of it. Saying, oh no, not this again. In those suttas that I mentioned, short suttas in the Samyutta, where he's giving these metaphors, like the oceans, the blood you've shed is greater than the oceans, and so on. There's and this is common in the sutta form, is a repetition. There's like a common statement at the end of each of these short suttas. It says, enough. You should become wearied. Enough. You should become dispassionate. Enough. You should become liberated. Enough to stop filling the cemeteries. Enough. Alang is repeated like a refrain. Like, enough. Why do you want to keep doing this? You've done it all. You've been here. You've been there. You've been a dog. You've been a Brahma. You've been a human being multiple times. You've been a man. You've been a woman. What? Enough. So when we're getting down to it, our own individual practice, it is easy to fall into the narrow obsession with our own formations. This can play out in all kinds of ways. One thing that we often see with meditators, someone who's on retreat, as a common sort of syndrome, is to become obsessed with something, some idea, and it sometimes, not uncommonly, even drives the person out of meditation. They become obsessed with some idea of something that they need to do right now, or some issue they have to deal with. And very often, in fact, almost always, once they're out, once they break the meditation, they're out of it. For a few hours, they think, oh, what the heck was that about? That is not so important. That could have waited. It's something to guard against in the meditation, is becoming obsessive, because the mind, you are practicing a close examination of phenomena as they arise. And if you're not skillful in having this fluidity of mind, of allowing the phenomena to arise, to be known, and to pass on, if you're subtly holding on to the phenomena, then you can become very narrowly focused and obsessed in certain patterns. What we're trying to understand is the general laws, the universal principles about how the mind works, and taking our own mind stream as an example only. Not that it has any particular special qualities or any uniqueness. For each one of us, our particular karmic situation at this moment is just that. It's just your particular karmic situation at this moment. You've come from somewhere and you're going somewhere else, and at this moment you're here. And this is what we have to work with. But to see it as a product of causes and conditions, to break it down and understand the difference between a mental formation and a feeling, a vedana, a perception, and to take none of them as being substantial or ultimately real. They're just phenomena passing through consciousness. So this, at both the macrocosmic level of seeing things in terms of the big view, the samsaric vastness, and at the microcosmic level of seeing individual mind moments rising and falling, what it should lead to is this sequence that is nibbida, viraga, vimutti. And in these suttas it's alang, enough to make you nibbida, alang, enough to give you viraga, alang, enough to become liberated. So nibbida, viraga, vimutti. Nibbida is that one, the word that's very difficult to translate, that means disenchantment or weariness or just having had enough of phenomena. And this comes from seeing, at the microcosmic level, it comes from seeing each individual phenomena is empty, unsatisfying, impermanent, conditioned. It's just more of the same. You know? At the macrocosmic level, it's seeing all the various possible formations, karmic formations, in existence in the vastness of samsara. They're all, any possible station in samsara is still just impermanent suffering. It's just a conditioned existence. And there's no station in samsara that's ultimately satisfying, that's permanent. And we've been through them all. So if you, and this allows the arising of viraga, the dispassion, the motive energy that keeps this all going. The driving engine of samsara is this craving that at the ultimate level is simply the craving for the next object. At any given moment, there's simply a craving, mind is craving to take an object. And this drives the whole of existence. The whole cosmic universe is driven by this craving. And underlying the craving is ignorance. It's not understanding. So the mind is endlessly jumping for the next object and coming into existence moment by moment. So samsara is seen in this way is not as a place or a thing. It's something you do. It's something you choose moment by moment and have been doing so for hundreds of thousands of aeons of time. So it's a pretty deeply rooted habit of mind. It's the primordial addiction, is mind wanting an object. And making it fully conscious, being fully awake, is the only way to begin to shake the process off. To reduce the ignorance factor gradually, wear it away by becoming more awake and seeing this is what's happening. And this is viraga, the passion, the craving fades away. The driving energy that keeps us bounding into existence moment by moment fades. And then one can become liberated, the vimutti, which literally means the breaking of the chains. That the mind can do that which it has not done since beginningless time, and alight upon non-occurrence, in the words of the Visuddhimagga, The mind lights upon non-occurrence. It just doesn't do that. Just in a single moment, it just, oh, I don't have to do that. And instead of being conditioned, then it touches upon the unconditioned, and this is liberation. This is the realization of nibbana. So to summarize the main theme I'm wanting to get across here this afternoon is in your practice to try and avoid the trap of being stuck in the personal, in your own issues, your own stuff. This kind of the poor me syndrome. And that can be shaken out of. You can avoid that by, on the one hand, cultivating the big view, seeing the universality of conditionality, of suffering, of dependent arising, and the vastness of it, and the insignificance of your own particular situation at this moment. And on the other hand, paying very close attention on the microcosmic level of actual occurrences in a single mind moment, which should be the goal of skillful development of vipassana is a close, objective, non-personal attention to the immediacy of this mind moment.